Before he became the father of English poetry, Geoffrey Chaucer stood in a medieval court accused of raptus, rape. He wasn't just a writer, he was a spy who watched his friends' heads rot on spikes and knew the king's darkest secrets. But when he suddenly vanished into a nameless grave, he left behind one final, terrifying question: was the greatest storyteller in history actually silenced by a royal hitman? Fourth day of May in the year 1380, a solitary woman walked through the cavernous entrance of Westminster Hall, the stone heart of English law and power. Her name was Cecily Champagne, and she carried with her the weight of an accusation that had the potential to shatter the career of a rising royal servant. The air in the vast hall was likely thick with the dust of parchment and the murmur of legal proceedings, a place where destinies were written in ink and sealed with wax. She had not come to prosecute, however, but to perform a strange and solemn legal ritual that would silence a scandal before it could destroy a man whose name is now synonymous with the very soul of English literature. In her hands, or perhaps in the hands of the clerks surrounding her, was a document that contained a word capable of ending a life on the gallows. The Latin term recorded on the membrane of vellum was raptus, a brutal legal designation that could encompass everything from abduction and forced marriage to violent sexual assault. The man accused of this crime was not a nameless brigand from the highways or a drunken soldier in a tavern brawl, but Geoffrey Chaucer. Centuries later, the world would revere him as a jovial storyteller and the benign father of English poetry, but on this spring day, he was a defendant standing in the shadow of a capital charge that contradicted every pleasant myth eventually spun around his legacy. The document that Cecily Champagne signed that day was a deed of release, a formal legal instrument known as a quitclaim, which absolved Chaucer of all felonies and actions concerning her rape or abduction. The ambiguity of the legal language has left a stain on history that no amount of scholarship can fully scrub away. In the 14th century, the line between the theft of a person for their property and the violation of a body was often blurred in the eyes of the law, yet the severity of the accusation remained absolute. Chaucer was effectively purchasing his innocence or perhaps enforcing it, ensuring that the dark details of what transpired between them would never see the inside of a trial court. Standing witness to this uncomfortable transaction were not mere clerks or local merchants, but some of the most powerful men in the Kingdom of England. The names listed on the document reveal that this was not a private dispute but a matter of state interest, protected by the highest echelons of the royal court. Among them were Sir William de Beauchamp and Sir John Clanvow, chamber knights and intimates of the king, men who wielded immense influence and whose presence in the hall served as a silent, intimidating reminder of who Chaucer was and who protected him. Their attendance suggests that the crown itself had stepped in to crush a problem that threatened one of its most useful assets. For the woman, Cecily, the presence of such formidable aristocracy must have been overwhelming, a physical manifestation of the impossible odds stacked against her. She was the daughter of a baker, a woman of the middle stratum of London society, standing against a wall of knights and royal bureaucrats. Whether she signed the document because she had been paid a significant sum of money, or because she had been threatened with ruin, remains a secret buried with her bones. The transaction was cold and bureaucratic, stripping away the human reality of fear and anger, leaving behind only a sanitized legal record that declared the matter closed forever. This event occurred during a period of Chaucer's life when he was far from the sedentary poet of popular imagination. He was a man deeply embedded in the gritty machinery of government, working as the controller of customs for the Port of London. Every day, he navigated a world of smugglers, bribes, and cutthroat politics, living in an apartment built directly over the city gates where the severed heads of traitors were displayed on spikes. The accusation of raptus was not an anomaly in a peaceful life but a flash of lightning revealing the dangerous and morally complex environment in which he operated. He was a man who knew how to survive, and the scene in Westminster Hall was a masterclass in survival. The dismissal of the charges allowed Chaucer to continue his ascent, eventually leading to diplomatic missions and further royal favor, but the shadow of the 4th of May never truly dissipated. It serves as a stark reminder that the author who would later write with such profound empathy about women in his tales was also a man capable of generating fear and necessitating a high-level cover-up. The complexity of his written characters, with their flaws and sins, was likely drawn from the mirror as much as from observation. He understood guilt and redemption because he had stood on the precipice of ruin, looking down into the abyss of public disgrace and execution. As Cecily Champagne walked away from Westminster Hall that day, vanishing back into the anonymity of the teeming streets of London, the parchment she left behind was rolled up and filed away in the close rolls. It would sit there for centuries, a dormant ghost waiting to haunt the biography of a legend. The narrative of the kindly old poet is a fabrication of later ages. The reality was a sharp-witted, politically connected operator who could summon the king's own knights to make a felony disappear. The story of Geoffrey Chaucer does not begin with a quill and a peaceful desk, but with a woman's silence and a powerful man's escape from justice. The story of Geoffrey Chaucer did not begin in the hushed libraries of scholars or the comfortable halls of Westminster, but in the terrifying, metallic din of the 100 Years' War. Long before he was the revered patriarch of English literature, he was merely another young man swept up in the grand and bloody ambitions of the Plantagenet dynasty. In the year 1359, England was gripped by a martial fever, a collective drive to assert the claim of King Edward III to the throne of France. Chaucer, then only a teenager of perhaps 16 or 17 years, traded his comfortable tunic for a padded gambeson and the heavy, unfamiliar weight of armor, stepping out of the merchant class and into the mud of a foreign battlefield. He was the son of a wealthy London vintner, a boy raised among wine barrels and ledgers rather than swords and shields, yet his family's connections had secured him a place in the household of Elizabeth de Burgh, the Countess of Ulster. This position was his gateway into the aristocracy, but in times of war, the distinction between a court page and a soldier evaporated rapidly. When the call to arms resonated through the narrow streets of London, the young Chaucer was expected to ride out not as a poet, but as a combatant in one of the largest invasion forces England had ever assembled. The romance of chivalry, so often celebrated in the songs of the time, was about to collide violently with the grim reality of a winter campaign. The army that crossed the English Channel in the autumn of 1359 was a staggering display of logistical might, designed to crush French resistance once and for all. Thousands of archers, men-at-arms, and knights, along with miles of supply wagons, landed on the continent with the intention of marching straight to Reims, the sacred city where French kings were crowned. Chaucer rode with the division of Prince Lionel, observing the machinery of war from the inside. He saw the pageantry of the banner snapping in the wind, but he also saw the immediate descent into brutality as the English host began its slow, destructive crawl across the countryside, burning villages and seizing crops in a strategy of calculated devastation. However, the French had learned from their catastrophic defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, refusing to meet the English in open battle, choosing instead to retreat behind the impenetrable stone walls of their fortified towns. The English campaign quickly transformed from a glorious march into a grueling test of endurance against the elements. The winter of that year was historically brutal, a relentless assault of freezing rain and biting winds that turned the roads of France into sucking quagmires of freezing mud. For a young man like Chaucer, accustomed to the relative warmth of a noble household, the exposure to the elements was a shock that likely chilled him to the bone, a physical misery that no amount of patriotic fervor could warm. By the time the English army arrived at the gates of Reims in December, the campaign had become a nightmare of attrition and logistical failure. The city was a fortress, its walls rising high and mocking the shivering soldiers who set up their camps in the sodden fields surrounding it. The siege was not a dramatic series of assaults but a slow, suffocating wait, where the primary enemies were not French knights but hunger, dysentery, and the piercing cold. Chaucer spent his days in this grim encampment, surrounded by the smells of wet wool, wood smoke, and the waste of thousands of men and horses, watching the grey stone of the cathedral in the distance, a prize that remained agonizingly out of reach. It was in this chaotic and desperate environment that the young poet's war came to an abrupt and terrifying end. The details of his capture are lost to the fog of history, but it likely happened during a foraging expedition or a minor skirmish in the countryside surrounding the besieged city. Soldiers were frequently sent out to scour the land for food and fodder, venturing away from the safety of the main lines into territory where French ambushes lay in wait. In a sudden eruption of violence, the young Chaucer found himself surrounded, cut off from his comrades, and forced to yield. The transition from besieger to prisoner was instantaneous, a jarring shift from being a hunter to becoming a bargaining chip in the economy of war. He was not killed on the spot, for in the medieval rules of engagement, a well-dressed young man with a connection to a noble house was worth more alive than dead. His captors, likely seeing the quality of his armor or the livery he wore, recognized the potential for ransom. Chaucer was stripped of his weapons and perhaps his horse, his hands bound, and he was marched away from the English lines into the interior of enemy territory. The fear of that moment must have been overwhelming, the uncertainty of whether he would be treated as a gentleman or thrown into a hole to rot, dependent entirely on the whims of men who viewed him as an invader and a source of profit. For weeks, Geoffrey Chaucer languished in captivity, an experience that would leave a permanent mark on his psyche and his understanding of human fragility. The location of his imprisonment is unknown, but it was likely a damp, dark cell in a French castle or a fortified town, far removed from the sunlight and the familiar sounds of his native tongue. He was cut off from the world, unaware if his family knew he was alive or if the army had moved on without him. In the silence of his confinement, the young man who would one day spin tales of knights and pilgrims was left alone with his thoughts, contemplating the very real possibility that his life would end in obscurity and disease before it had truly begun. The psychological toll of medieval imprisonment was severe, designed to break the spirit and encourage a swift payment from the prisoner's family or liege lord. Chaucer endured the cold and the bad food, the isolation and the dread, while negotiations for his release moved at the glacial pace of 14th-century diplomacy. He was merely one of many prisoners taken during the siege, a small item on a long list of losses, and there was no guarantee that anyone in the high command would prioritize the return of a vintner's son when noble knights and valuable commanders were also being held for ransom. He was a small cog in a vast machine, easily replaceable and easily forgotten. Back in the English camp, however, the administrative machinery of the royal household was grinding onward, and Chaucer had not been forgotten. On the first day of March in the year 1360, a clerk in the royal wardrobe dipped his quill into ink to record a payment that would alter the course of literary history. The entry in the ledger was brief and businesslike, a payment of £16 toward the ransom of Geoffrey Chaucer. To the modern ear, the sum sounds trivial, but in the 14th century, it was a significant amount of money, roughly equivalent to the annual wages of a skilled craftsman or the price of a substantial herd of livestock. King Edward III paid this sum personally, a fact that speaks volumes about the young man's standing even at that early age. The crown did not spend £16 out of sentimental charity or simple kindness. The King of England was not in the habit of rescuing every lost page boy. The payment was a calculated investment. The king and his advisers had evidently seen something in Chaucer during the campaign or in his service at court, a spark of intelligence, a reliability, or perhaps a specific set of skills that made him worth retrieving from the enemy. They were buying back an asset they intended to use. The amount of £16 was a threshold that separated the common soldier from the valuable retainer. It was an acknowledgement that Chaucer was considered a member of the royal affinity, someone whose safety was the king's responsibility. When the news of the ransom reached him in his cell, it must have felt like a divine intervention, a reprieve from a death sentence. The heavy wooden doors were unlocked, the chains were struck off, and he was led out of the darkness and back into the winter light, a freeman once again, but now bound by a debt of gratitude and service to the monarch who had purchased his life. This experience of captivity and release fundamentally changed the trajectory of Chaucer's life. He returned to the English court not just as a survivor of the war, but as a man who had seen the underside of the chivalric ideal. He had witnessed the failure of the siege of Reims, where the English army eventually packed up and marched away without taking the city, and he had experienced the helplessness of being a pawn in the political games of powerful men. The romantic gloss of knighthood had been stripped away by the mud, the cold, and the fear of the dungeon, replaced by a hardened realism that would later infuse his writing with its characteristic irony and grounding in the messy truth of human existence. More importantly, the crown's intervention suggested that his role was shifting from that of a simple soldier to something more complex and cerebral. The king needed men who were not just strong with a sword, but sharp with their wits, men who could navigate the treacherous waters of diplomacy and observation. Chaucer, with his fluency in French, his merchant-class practicality, and his courtly education, was the perfect candidate for a new kind of warfare, one fought with whispers, sealed letters, and secret negotiations. The ransom was effectively his hiring bonus for a career in intelligence and diplomacy. Upon his return to England, the young veteran did not go back to the wine trade of his father. He was absorbed deeper into the royal household, moving from the service of Prince Lionel to the direct employment of the king. He had been tested in the fire of the Reims campaign and had emerged with a new understanding of power. He learned that survival depended not on physical strength, but on being useful to those who held the purse strings. The £16 paid for his freedom was the price of his loyalty, binding him to the intricate and dangerous machinery of the state for the rest of his days. The father of English poetry was thus forged in the indignity of a prisoner of war camp. The silence of the dungeon had taught him the value of words, and the transaction of his ransom had taught him the value of men. He had been weighed, measured, and purchased. As he rode back toward the coast, leaving the ravaged fields of France behind him, Geoffrey Chaucer was no longer just a citizen of London, he was a king's man, a creature of the court, and a quiet observer who had learned that in the great game of kingdoms, everyone has a price, and even a life can be reduced to a line item in a ledger. The soldier had died in the cell, the spy and diplomat was born in the moment the coins changed hands. Having shed the rusted mail of a prisoner of war, Geoffrey Chaucer stepped into a world that was softer to the touch but infinitely more treacherous to the soul. The transition from the muddy encampments of France to the perfumed corridors of Westminster marked the beginning of his true education, not as a warrior, but as a man of shadows. He exchanged the heavy broadsword for the quill and the seal, donning the velvet robes of a courtier and diplomat. Yet, this new attire was merely a costume for a different kind of combat, one fought with whispers, bribes, and sealed letters rather than arrows and cavalry charges. The King of England, Edward III, had recognized that the young men who survived the siege of Reims possessed a sharp mind and a discreet tongue, qualities far more valuable than brute strength in the complex geopolitical chess game of the 14th century. In the year 1372, the crown entrusted Chaucer with a mission that would take him to the very edge of the known world, or at least, the world as an Englishman understood it. He was commissioned to travel to Italy, a land of fabled wealth, fractious city-states, and dangerous enlightenment. On the surface, his mandate was bureaucratic and dull. He was to negotiate with the merchants of Genoa regarding the establishment of a special port for English wool. It was the perfect cover story, boring enough to deflect suspicion, yet important enough to justify the expense of the journey. However, the true purpose of his voyage lay hidden beneath the stacks of trade agreements. He was an agent of the crown sent to secure the sinews of war for a kingdom that was slowly bleeding dry. The journey began in the damp chill of an English November, a time when sensible men stayed by their hearths. Chaucer, accompanied by 2 Italian experts and a small retinue, rode south toward the coast, leaving behind his wife and the familiar grey skies of London. Crossing the Channel was only the first hurdle. The true test lay in the formidable barrier of the Alps. To reach Italy in the dead of winter required a kind of madness or desperate loyalty. The mountain passes were frozen death traps, where a single misstep on the icy paths meant a fall into the abyss, and where wolf packs and brigands stalked the snowy ridges. For weeks, the future poet endured the biting wind and the blinding white silence of the mountains, a physical ordeal that stripped away the comforts of the court and reminded him once again of the fragility of life. When the party finally descended into the plains of Lombardy and reached the coast of Liguria, the shock must have been visceral. Italy in the 14th century was not merely a different country, it was a different universe compared to the wooden towns and muddy streets of England. Here, the ruins of the Roman Empire still stood as colossal reminders of a lost greatness, and the cities were built of marble and stone, basking in a light that seemed sharper and more unforgiving than the northern sun. Genoa rose from the sea like a fortress of greed and glory, a republic of sailors and bankers who owed allegiance to no king and worshipped only the gold florin. Into this alien landscape walked Geoffrey Chaucer, a man from a backward island nation, tasked with outsmarting some of the most astute negotiators in Christendom. In the Doge's palace in Genoa, surrounded by the murmur of the Mediterranean and the shouts of stevedores, Chaucer played the part of the commercial envoy. He sat across from the Genoese officials, discussing tariffs, wool bales, and shipping rights with the dry precision of a customs officer. He knew the value of English sheep, the lifeblood of the economy, and he used it as leverage. But while his mouth spoke of commerce, his eyes were scanning the room, assessing the political currents, looking for the cracks in the Genoese armor where English influence could be inserted. He was learning that a diplomat's greatest weapon is patience, the ability to sit through hours of tedium while waiting for the single moment of opportunity that justifies the entire enterprise. Yet, the wool trade was merely the prelude to the darker business at hand. England was still locked in the endless conflict with France, and King Edward needed ships to control the narrow seas and mercenaries to fight his battles. Chaucer's secret directive was to secure naval support and perhaps even loans to finance the war machine. He moved from the public council chambers to private rooms where the air was thick with conspiracy and the negotiations were far more blunt. Here, he dealt with the condottieri, the captains of fortune who sold their armies to the highest bidder. He learned the cold arithmetic of violence. How much for a galley? How much for 100 crossbowmen? How much to burn a rival's fleet? From Genoa, his mission took him inland to Florence, the banking capital of the Western world. If Genoa was the muscle of Italy, Florence was its calculating brain. The city was a dazzling labyrinth of towers and palazzos, dominated by the rising structure of the great cathedral, a testament to human ambition. But for Chaucer, Florence was the home of the Bardi and Peruzzi families, the superbankers who had once financed the English crown and had been ruined when the king defaulted. Walking these streets, Chaucer was walking into a den of creditors, a place where the English name was synonymous with bad debt. He had to navigate this hostility with supreme tact, seeking new lines of credit for a monarch who had a reputation for not paying his bills. It was in these Italian courts that Chaucer encountered a different kind of power, personified by the Visconti family of Milan. While not his primary destination on this specific trip, the shadow of the Visconti loomed over all of Italy. Bernabo Visconti, the tyrant of Milan, was a man who ruled through terror, poison, and a network of spies that was the envy of every monarch in Europe. In England, power was often crude and direct, a head on a spike or an army in the field. In Italy, Chaucer saw that power could be subtle, a complex web of marriage alliances, assassinations, and psychological warfare. He realized that a well-placed rumor could be as destructive as a siege engine, and that information was the most valuable currency of all. This immersion in the cutthroat politics of the Italian city-states transformed Chaucer from a mere messenger into a true intelligence asset. He learned to read the unspoken language of the court, the slight hesitation in a reply, the nervous glance of a courtier, the forced smile of a potential enemy. He understood that in this world, nobody was who they claimed to be. The pious monk might be a messenger for a rival faction, the charming merchant might be an assassin. He began to see the world not as a fixed hierarchy of God-given roles, but as a fluid stage where men and women wore masks, performing their parts while hiding their true intentions. This cynicism, born of survival, would become the bedrock of his literary voice. However, the most profound discovery Chaucer made in Italy was not political or military, but artistic. In the midst of his espionage and negotiations, he encountered the ghosts of giants. He discovered the works of Dante Alighieri, Giovanni Boccaccio, and Francis Petrarch. In England, literature was largely a matter of French romances or Latin theology, distant and often stale. But here, in Tuscany, these men were writing in the vernacular, the language of the streets and the markets, elevating the common tongue to the height of sublime art. He likely held manuscripts of the Divine Comedy in his own hands, struggling with the Tuscan dialect, feeling the electric shock of reading poetry that spoke directly to the human condition with a realism he had never encountered before. He was particularly struck by Boccaccio, whose Decameron featured a structure that would one day inspire his own masterpiece. He saw how Boccaccio used a frame narrative, a group of people fleeing the plague, to tell a multitude of stories that ranged from the bawdy to the tragic. This was a revelation. It showed him that high art did not have to be about distant heroes like Arthur or Roland, it could be about millers, friars, wives, and students. He realized that the messy, contradictory, hilarious reality of life he saw every day in the customs house or the military camp was worthy of literature. The Italians taught him that the world of the gutter and the world of the divine were not separate, but intertwined. This literary awakening was not separate from his work as a spy, rather, the two fed into each other. Chaucer realized that the skills required to write a great story were the same skills required to be a great agent: observation, empathy, and the ability to construct a believable narrative. He understood that a spy, like a poet, creates a fiction to hide the truth. When he wrote his reports back to England, he was crafting a narrative of events. When he later wrote his poems, he was encoding the truths he had seen in the courts of Europe. The line between his cover story and his creative work began to blur. He saw that a man could hide his true self behind a wall of words, just as he hid the king's secrets behind his diplomatic credentials. The Italy trip of 1372 was the crucible that forged the mature Chaucer. He had left England as a capable civil servant. He returned as a man of the world, carrying in his saddlebags not just treaties and financial instruments, but the seeds of the English Renaissance. He had seen the magnificent ruthlessness of the Visconti and the sublime beauty of Dante's verse, and he understood that they were two sides of the same coin. He had learned that civilization is a thin veneer over the primal struggle for power, a lesson that would make his later writings resonate with a deep, often cynical understanding of human nature. As he crossed the Alps once more, heading back toward the grey dampness of London, Geoffrey Chaucer was no longer just the son of a vintner. He was a man who carried a dangerous amount of knowledge. He knew the weakness of the English crown's finances, he knew the shifting alliances of the Italian states, and he knew the secret power of the vernacular language. He had learned to move through the world without leaving a trace, to listen more than he spoke, and to see the irony in every human endeavor. The diplomat had succeeded in his mission, but the artist had found his voice. The impact of this journey would ripple through the rest of his life. Upon his return, he was granted a pitcher of wine daily for life by the king, a reward that signifies a job well done, though the details of his success remained buried in the verbal reports he gave to the monarch. He resumed his life in London, but he viewed his own country through new eyes. The chaotic streets of London were no longer just home, they were a canvas. The people he met were no longer just countrymen, they were characters waiting to be written. The spy who had learned to read the hidden motives of Italian princes would now turn his gaze to the miller, the reeve, and the wife of Bath, dissecting their souls with the same forensic precision he had used in the great game of European diplomacy. Thus, the father of English poetry was not born in a vacuum of academic study, but in the high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled world of international espionage. His genius lay in his ability to synthesize the high culture of Italy with the low reality of his daily work. He brought the sunlight of the Renaissance to the cloudy shores of England, but he filtered it through the skeptical, observant eye of a man who knew that every golden florin has a price and every beautiful story hides a secret. The diplomat's mask never truly came off, it simply transformed into the persona of the narrator, the genial guide who smiles at the pilgrims while exposing their deepest sins. On the 8th day of June in the year 1374, Geoffrey Chaucer returned to London not as a conquering hero or a celebrated poet, but as a newly appointed civil servant entering the belly of the beast. The king had granted him the office of comptroller of the customs and subsidy of wools, skins, and tanned hides for the port of London. To the uninitiated, this title might suggest a comfortable sinecure, a reward for years of loyal service where a man could rest on his laurels and collect a steady income. The reality, however, was a brutal descent into the grimiest and most lucrative machinery of the English state. Chaucer was not being sent to a quiet office, he was being placed on the front lines of an economic war, tasked with extracting every penny of tax from the most ruthless merchants in Europe. The commodity at the heart of his new life was wool, a substance that was to medieval England what oil is to the modern world. It was the golden fleece, the primary source of the kingdom's wealth and the collateral for the king's endless wars. The tax on wool exports financed the armies, built the castles, and paid the bribes that kept the geopolitical wheels turning. By placing Chaucer in charge of the London customs, the crown was entrusting him with the keys to the treasury. This was a position of immense responsibility that required unshakable diligence, for the temptation to skim off the top was overwhelming, and the pressure from powerful men to look the other way was a constant, physical threat. His workspace was the Wool Wharf, located just downstream from London Bridge, a chaotic, wooden structure jutting out into the churning, filth-strewn waters of the Thames. Here, the sensory assault was absolute. The air was thick with the stench of raw wool, wet sheepskins, tar, and the sewage that flowed freely into the river. From dawn until dusk, the wharf was a cacophony of shouting stevedores, creaking cranes, and the babble of foreign tongues as Italian, Flemish, and German merchants haggled over weights and measures. Chaucer, the man who had translated the delicate verses of French romance, now spent his days surrounded by the coarse reality of commerce, where the only poetry was the rhythmic thud of heavy bales hitting the deck. The terms of his employment were unusually strict, explicitly stating that he was to write the rolls with his own hand and perform his duties in person, without the aid of a deputy. For 12 long years, Chaucer was chained to his ledger, a prisoner of his own competence. He stood at the custom house counter, inspecting every cargo, verifying the seals, and recording the names of the ships and the masters. This was physically exhausting, repetitive labor that ruined the eyes and cramped the hand. Yet, it was this very requirement of personal attendance that forced him to look into the faces of the thousands of people passing through the port, stripping away their social masks to evaluate their goods and their honesty. In this environment, Chaucer was forced to navigate a treacherous path through a swamp of institutional corruption. The customs house was notoriously crooked, a place where bribes were the standard currency and smuggling was a parallel industry. He worked alongside the collectors, men like the powerful and dangerous Nicholas Brember, a future Lord Mayor of London who would eventually be executed for treason. These men were not merely bureaucrats, they were political heavyweights who used their positions to crush rivals and amass fortunes. Chaucer had to survive in their orbit, maintaining his integrity, or at least the appearance of it, while knowing that a single misstep could make him a target of the city's most ruthless factions. The daily friction with liars, cheats, and desperate men became the ultimate education for the writer. Every time a merchant swore on a stack of Bibles that his cargo was lighter than it looked, Chaucer saw performance. He learned to spot the nervous tick of a smuggler, the feigned outrage of a captain caught with hidden hides, and the greasy charm of a middleman trying to slide a coin across the counter. He was compiling a mental encyclopedia of human deceit. The ledger book became a mirror of the soul. In recording the taxes, he was also recording the sins of the populace, noting how easily men would damn themselves for a few extra shillings of profit. It was here, amidst the swearing sailors and the smell of wet dogs and salt water, that the characters of the Canterbury Tales began to take flesh and blood form. The shipman, later immortalized in his verse as a man who sent his prisoners home by water, a euphemism for drowning them, was not a figment of imagination. He was drawn from the pirates and privateers Chaucer dealt with daily, men from Dartmouth and the West Country who were half merchant, half murderer. Chaucer saw the brutality in their eyes and the dagger on a lanyard around their necks, realizing that the romance of the sea was a lie covering a reality of blood and theft. Similarly, the merchant, with his forked beard and motley dress, hiding his debts behind a facade of prosperity, was a figure Chaucer knew all too well. He saw them every day, men dressed in the finest Flemish beaver hats, speaking solemnly of their profits while secretly teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, terrified that one lost ship would ruin them. Chaucer understood the anxiety behind the arrogance, the desperate need to maintain appearances in a cutthroat society. He saw the comedy in their pretension and the tragedy in their fragility, observations that would later allow him to write about them with a mixture of biting satire and surprising empathy. Even the darker figures, like the reeve or the manciple, found their genesis in the bureaucratic warfare of the customs house. Chaucer watched how stewards and clerks skimmed off the top, how they manipulated figures to cheat their lords, and how they used their intelligence to outwit their intellectual superiors. He saw the cunning of the uneducated and the foolishness of the learned. The port was a microcosm of the world, a place where the social hierarchy was flattened by the pursuit of money, and where a clever miller could cheat a knight, provided he knew how to rig the scales. During these years, Chaucer lived in a dwelling that was as unique and isolating as his job, an apartment built directly over the stone arch of Aldgate, one of the main fortified entrances to the city of London. He leased this space in the same year he took the customs job, finding a home that literally suspended him above the teeming masses. Every morning, he would descend from his tower to walk to the wharf, and every evening he would climb back up, rising above the noise and the filth. The apartment shook with the rumble of carts passing through the gate below, a constant reminder of the restless energy of the capital that never slept. This physical elevation over the city served as a perfect metaphor for his dual life. By day, he was immersed in the muck, a participant in the grinding machinery of the state. By night, alone in his room above the gate, he lit his candle and transformed from the controller into the creator. The contrast was stark and essential. If he had been a cloistered monk or a country gentleman, his writing might have been pretty but hollow. Because he was a man who went home with ink on his fingers and the smell of the river in his clothes, his writing possessed a grounding in reality that was unprecedented in English literature. The isolation of Aldgate also hints at the loneliness of his position. He was a man between worlds, too bourgeois for the high aristocracy, yet too educated and courtly for the merchants he regulated. In his poems, he often presents himself as an outsider, a figure on the periphery looking in. This was his literal reality. Sitting in his tower, he was the city's watchman, not looking for invading armies, but observing the invasion of humanity. He watched the pilgrims, the traders, the soldiers, and the beggars passing through the gate, each one a potential story walking on two legs. The danger of his work cannot be overstated, for the customs was a place where violence simmered just below the surface. Smugglers were not lovable rogues, they were organized criminal enterprises that did not hesitate to use intimidation. Chaucer was unarmed, protected only by the king's seal and his own wits. There were times when he was personally robbed, and times when his political patrons fell from grace, leaving him exposed to the wolves. That he survived 12 years in such a post without being murdered or thrown into prison for corruption is a testament to his supreme adaptability and his ability to remain useful to whoever held the whip hand. By the time he finally surrendered his controllership in 1386, Geoffrey Chaucer was a changed man. The youth who had dreamed of chivalry in the fields of France was gone, replaced by a middle-aged bureaucrat who had seen every trick in the book. He had counted the cost of the king's wars in sacks of wool and measured the morality of his countrymen in evaded taxes. He was tired, likely cynical, but he was also full to the brim with material. The dirt of the London docks had settled into his imagination, providing the fertile soil from which the pilgrims would spring, ready to ride out of the tabard inn and into immortality. Thus, the father of English poetry did not find his voice in a garden of roses, but in the ledger books of the custom house. His genius was the ability to find the universal in the administrative, to see the epic in the mundane. The 12 years of drudgery were the kiln that fired his art, proving that to write truly about the human condition, one must first endure the smell of its commerce and the weight of its greed. He left the wharf, but the wharf never left him. It echoed in the ribald laughter of his characters and the sharp, unforgiving realism of his greatest tales. The year 1386 marked the moment when the Wheel of Fortune, a concept that Geoffrey Chaucer had translated and pondered in his philosophical readings, turned with a grinding, violent finality against him. For over a decade, he had thrived in the warm, golden orbit of King Richard II, enjoying the protection of the court and the steady income of the customs house. But the young king's favoritism and perceived tyranny had curdled the mood of the nobility, breeding a toxic resentment that finally erupted into open rebellion. The storm that broke over England was not atmospheric but political, a purge led by a group of powerful magnates known as the Lords Appellant, who were determined to cleanse the court of what they deemed corrupt influences. Chaucer, ever the astute observer, must have felt the temperature dropping long before the first arrests were made. He sat in the Parliament of 1386, watching in silence as the king's authority was systematically dismantled by his own uncles and the vengeful aristocracy. The air in Westminster was no longer thick with the dust of bureaucracy, but with the metallic scent of fear. The poet was not a primary target, he was too small a fish to be worth a treason trial, but he was dangerously adjacent to the men who were. He was a creature of the court, a man who owed everything to the royal favor, and in the eyes of the appellants, that made him complicit in the disastrous reign of Richard. The horror truly began with the merciless Parliament of 1388, a grim spectacle where the rule of law was weaponized to commit judicial murder. Chaucer watched from the sidelines as his close associates and former colleagues were dragged before the tribunal, stripped of their dignity, and condemned to death. The most shocking blow was the execution of Nicholas Brember, the former Lord Mayor of London and Chaucer's direct superior at the customs house. Brember was not just a colleague, he was a titan of the city, a man who had seemed untouchable. Seeing him dragged on a hurdle to Tyburn and hanged was a terrifying lesson in the fragility of power. Even more chilling for a man of letters was the fate of Thomas Usk, a fellow writer and scrivener whom Chaucer knew well. Usk had tried to play both sides, betraying his former masters to save his own skin, but the Lords Appellant were unforgiving. He was sentenced to a traitor's death, executed with a brutality that was excessive even for the 14th century. For Chaucer, the message was written in blood, words could kill, and no amount of clever maneuvering could save a man when the political tides shifted violently. The execution of Usk was a grim reminder that intellect was no shield against the axe, and that the pen could easily become a death warrant if it wrote the wrong things. In the wake of this purge, Chaucer's own life began to dismantle. He was stripped of his controller's post, the job that had sustained him and his family for 12 years. The loss was not just financial, it was an eviction from the center of the world. He was forced to vacate his apartment above Aldgate, leaving the city that had been his muse and his tormentor. The poet who had walked the corridors of power was now effectively a refugee in his own country, cast out by the new regime. He retreated to the county of Kent, a move that historians often describe as a retirement, but which feels more like a desperate flight to safety, a way to put miles of mud and forest between himself and the vengeful lords in Westminster. Life in Kent was a stark departure from the bustling energy of the London wharves. Here, in the quiet damp of the countryside, Chaucer faced a new enemy, poverty. The generous flow of royal patronage had dried up, replaced by the trickle of small annuities that were often paid late or not at all. He was forced to navigate the humiliation of debt, borrowing money against future payments, a fallen courtier trying to maintain the facade of gentility while his purse grew lighter by the day. The silence of the rural landscape likely weighed heavily on a man addicted to the noise and chaos of the city, leaving him alone with the ghosts of his executed friends. It was during these dark years that the physical dangers of the 14th century caught up with him, transforming the metaphorical violence of politics into literal blows. On several occasions, while traveling the roads between London and Kent, perhaps to petition for his pension or attend to minor legal duties, Chaucer was waylaid by highwaymen. These were not the romantic outlaws of later ballads, but desperate, violent men who saw a lone traveler as prey. At a place known as the Foul Oak, he was set upon, beaten, and robbed of his horse and what little money he carried. The court records detail the theft of £20, a crushing sum for a man already on the brink of insolvency. The psychological toll of these assaults must have been devastating. to be beaten in the mud, to feel the helplessness of the victim, shattered whatever lingering sense of security he might have had. The man who had once negotiated treaties with Italian princes was now reduced to a bruised figure limping along a dirt road, stripped of his dignity and his coin. These attacks were a visceral reminder that the king's peace was a fiction, and that without the protection of a powerful patron, a man was nothing more than meat for the wolves. The physical pain of his injuries would have mirrored the internal pain of his fall from grace, creating a symphony of misery that threatened to silence his voice forever. Yet, it was precisely in this cauldron of despair, exile, and fear that Chaucer's genius found its ultimate form. Denied his position in the government and removed from the daily grind of the customs, he found himself with the one thing he had never possessed: time. He turned to his parchment not as a hobby, but as a lifeline, a way to reconstruct a world that made sense when the real one had gone mad. He began to conceive of a project that was vast, ambitious, and fundamentally democratic, a collection of stories told not by noble heroes, but by a motley group of travelers who represented the very society that was crumbling around him. The Canterbury Tales was born not from a peaceful retirement, but from a desperate need to assert control over chaos. The structure of the pilgrimage was a stroke of brilliance. It allowed him to bring together enemies, the knight and the miller, the parson and the pardoner, and force them to coexist in a way that the Lord's Appellant and the king could not. It was a microcosm of England, a paper kingdom where Chaucer played God, deciding who spoke, who triumphed, and who looked foolish. In a world where his friends were being beheaded for their politics, he created a safe space where the most dangerous ideas could be voiced under the guise of a game. The decision to set the destination as Canterbury, the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, was in itself a loaded choice. Becket was the ultimate martyr to royal tyranny, a man who had been murdered by a king's henchman. By sending his pilgrims to Becket's tomb, Chaucer was subtly invoking the tension between spiritual purity and political corruption. It was a journey toward redemption, something the exile desperately needed. But unlike a traditional pious tract, Chaucer filled the road with humor, filth, and irreverence. He was laughing in the dark, using satire to keep the terror at bay, proving that while his body could be beaten and his purse stolen, his mind remained the sharpest weapon in the realm. The writing of the tales became a coded act of resistance. When he wrote that Knight's Tale, with its focus on order, chivalry, and the fickle nature of the gods, he was mourning the loss of the stability he had known under Edward III. When he allowed the miller to interrupt the night with a story of adultery and practical jokes, he was acknowledging the unruly, chaotic energy of the common people that no government could fully suppress. He was processing the trauma of the peasants' revolt and the merciless parliament, encoding his observations of class warfare into a contest of storytelling. There is a palpable sense of urgency in the later fragments of the tales, a feeling that the author is writing against the dying of the light. He knew that his position was precarious, that the political winds could shift again and sweep him away entirely. This anxiety seeped into the text, particularly in the retraction, where he apologizes for his worldly works. But in the main body of the tales, he remains defiant. He populates his road with thieves and liars who look suspiciously like the men he encountered in the customs house and the royal court, granting them immortality even as he exposes their vices. The Men of Law, one of his pilgrims, speaks of the dangers of poverty, echoing Chaucer's own recent experiences with a bitterness that feels personal. "If thou be poor, thy brother hateth thee," the character says, a line that must have resonated deeply with the poet who had seen his fair-weather friends vanish when the money stopped. He was writing from the scarred tissue of his own life, turning the indignity of the foul oak robbery and the shame of his debts into art. The poverty that tried to crush him instead stripped away the last layers of courtly pretension, leaving him with a raw, unvarnished view of humanity. Thus, the greatest work of English literature was forged in the fire of personal catastrophe. It was not the product of a comfortable scholar, but the desperate invention of a survivor. The Canterbury Tales was Chaucer's answer to the executioner's axe and the highwayman's club. It was his way of saying that though the king might fall and the laws might change, the human story, in all its messy, hilarious, tragic glory, endures. He wrote to save his sanity, weaving a tapestry of voices that would outlast the stone walls of Westminster Hall and the silence of his own exile, ensuring that while his enemies might have taken his job, they could never take his voice. The final chapter of Geoffrey Chaucer's life opens not with the peaceful decline of a revered elder, but with the terrifying collapse of the world he had known for 3 decades. In the year 1399, the fragile stability of England was shattered when Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile to seize the crown from Richard II. For Chaucer, this was not merely a change of monarchs, it was a catastrophe that placed him directly in the crosshairs of a violent revolution. He had been a servant of Richard, a recipient of his patronage, and a man deeply embedded in the court culture that the new regime was determined to eradicate. As the usurper Henry IV ascended the steps of the throne, the poet found himself standing on a precipice, an old man associated with a deposed and starving king, desperately trying to navigate a political landscape where loyalty to the past was punishable by death. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, Chaucer displayed the survival instincts that had served him well since his days as a prisoner in France. He did not flee, nor did he hide, instead, he wrote. He composed the Complaint of Chaucer to his purse, a poem that is often read as a charmingly humorous request for money, but which was, in reality, a masterful piece of diplomatic submission. In the final stanza, he explicitly recognized Henry as the legitimate king by right of conquest and free election, a public declaration of allegiance designed to save his neck. The strategy appeared to work. The new king, perhaps recognizing the value of such a prominent propagandist or perhaps swayed by family connections, doubled Chaucer's annuity. On paper, the poet was safe, welcomed into the fold of the new Lancastrian dynasty with promises of financial security and royal favor. However, the reality of his situation was far more precarious than the royal ledgers suggested. In December of 1399, Chaucer made a move that has baffled historians and fueled centuries of speculation. He leased a tenement in the garden of the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey. On the surface, this looks like a retirement plan, a desire to live within the sanctified and peaceful precincts of the church. Yet, a closer examination of the lease reveals a desperate undertone. The house was located within the sanctuary grounds of the abbey, a legal zone where the king's writ did not run and where debtors and political refugees could not be arrested. Chaucer was not moving to Westminster for the view, he was moving there because he was afraid. He was seeking the one place in London where the long arm of the new government's vengeance might struggle to reach him. The lease he signed was for 53 years, a defiantly optimistic duration for a man in his late 50s, suggesting that he had no intention of dying anytime soon. He was planning for a long future, settling into a house that offered him physical protection and proximity to the center of power. Yet, as the year 1400 dawned, a strange and total silence descended upon him. The man who had spent his life generating paperwork, customs rolls, diplomatic reports, treaties, and poems, suddenly ceased to exist in the written record. There are no receipts for his pension, no letters to his son Thomas, and, most chillingly, no further verses. The voice that had created the wife of Bath and the partner was abruptly cut off, as if a heavy curtain had been dropped over his life. The political atmosphere of early 1400 was toxic with paranoia and treason. In January, the Epiphany Rising, a plot by loyalists of the deposed Richard to assassinate Henry IV and his sons, was discovered and brutally crushed. The rebels were men Chaucer knew personally, they were the courtiers and knights he had dined with for years. Although there is no evidence he was involved in the plot, his association with the conspirators would have made him a person of interest to the crown. In a regime terrified of counter-revolution, an old poet with a sharp pen and a history of service to the former king was a liability. He knew where the bodies were buried, both metaphorically and literally, and he possessed the intellect to critique the legitimacy of the usurper in ways that could damage the fragile new dynasty. Even more dangerous than the king was the shadow of Thomas Arundel, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Arundel was a fanatic, a man determined to stamp out the Lollard heresy and reassert the absolute authority of the church. Chaucer's friends included known Lollard knights, and his own writings were dangerously anticlerical. The Canterbury Tales is filled with corrupt pardoners, lecherous friars, and hypocritical monks. To a man like Arundel, who would soon introduce the statute to Hirtico Comberendo, the burning of heretics, Chaucer was not a harmless entertainer. He was a dangerous social critic whose vernacular poetry was spreading subversive ideas among the common people. In the eyes of the church, the man hiding in the garden of Westminster Abbey was a threat to the spiritual order of the realm. The silence of 1400 stretches on until the autumn, and then, on the 25th of October, it becomes permanent. The date comes from an inscription added to his tomb more than a century later, but there is no contemporary record of his passing. This absence of documentation is the smoking gun of the mystery. Geoffrey Chaucer was a man of property and a legal expert. He had spent his life dealing with the transfer of goods and titles. It is inconceivable that such a man would die of natural causes without leaving a will. In the medieval period, dying intestate was a spiritual and legal calamity, yet no will was ever probated, and northwest administration of his estate was ever recorded. It is as if his property and his final wishes were simply erased, bypassed by a power that wanted the matter closed with immediate effect. The lack of a will suggests a death that was sudden, unexpected, and perhaps managed by the state. If he had fallen ill, there would have been time to summon a scrivener. If he had died of old age, his affairs would have been in order. The void in the archives points to a scenario where the father of English poetry was silenced before he could speak his final words. The suspicion arises that he was removed, quietly and efficiently, by agents of the crown or the church who decided that he had outlived his usefulness and that his continued existence was a risk they were no longer willing to take. The sanctuary of Westminster, which he had relied upon for safety, may have ultimately become his trap, a secluded place where a murder could be disguised as a natural passing. The manner of his burial reinforces the theory of a hurried cover-up. He was not interred with the honor due to a great courtier or a famous poet. There was no grand procession, no eulogy from the king. He was buried in a grave at the entrance to the chapel of St. Benedict, a cramped and undistinguished spot typically reserved for abbey staff or minor functionaries. It was a disposal rather than a funeral. The location suggests that the authorities wanted him underground as quickly and unobtrusively as possible, in a place where he would be forgotten. The grand monument that stands there today was not erected until 1556. For a century and a half, Chaucer lay in a nondescript grave, his name fading into the stone floor, a victim of the political amnesia imposed by the Lancastrian regime. The tragedy of Chaucer's end lies in the stark contrast between the humanity of his writing and the cold brutality of his likely fate. He was a man who had dedicated his life to observing the world with humor, empathy, and a deep understanding of human frailty. He had given a voice to the voiceless, capturing the spirit of England in all its messy diversity. Yet, in his final moments, he was likely alone, betrayed by the system he had served, facing the realization that his wit and his words could no longer protect him. The man who had survived the plague, the 100 Years' War, and the treacherous courts of Europe was ultimately undone by the ruthless pragmatism of a new king who needed to tidy up the loose ends of the past. The rise of his son, Thomas Chaucer, in the years following Geoffrey's death adds a final, cynical twist to the narrative. Thomas became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, serving as Speaker of the House of Commons and enjoying the full favor of the Lancastrian kings. His rapid ascent invites a dark question: was his success the price of his silence? Did the son trade justice for his father in exchange for political advancement? It is a transaction that fits perfectly into the world Geoffrey described in his tales, a world where every man has a price, and where moral outrage is often quietly smothered by a bag of gold. The family thrived, but the patriarch was left to rot in an unmarked grave, his disappearance accepted as the cost of doing business with the crown. Today, tourists flock to Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey to pay homage to the literary giant, gazing at the marble tomb with reverence. They see the founder of a tradition, the men who proved that the English language was capable of greatness. But they are standing on a crime scene. The corner was not designated for poets because of Chaucer's fame. He was buried there because it was a convenient dark corner for a body that needed to disappear. The shrine to literature is built upon a foundation of political murder. The father of English poetry did not drift gently into the good night, he was extinguished, a candle blown out by the harsh winds of a coup d'état. The mystery of 1400 remains unsolved, but the evidence paints a portrait of a man who knew too much and died for it. The jovial storyteller, the spinner of bawdy jokes and courtly romances, was in the end a casualty of the brutal Game of Thrones. His final chapter was not written with a quill, but with the silence of the grave. As we read the Canterbury Tales, laughing at the miller and weeping with the clerk, we are hearing the voice of a man who was hunted down by his own government. The ultimate irony is that while they managed to kill the men and hide the body, they failed to kill the work. The stories survived the usurpation, the censorship, and the centuries, standing as a defiant testament to the truth that art is the one thing that tyranny cannot murder.